Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic podcast. I'm Alex Kapitko, joined by my friend and co-host Drew Nepley. Drew, how you doing?
Hello, Alex. Hello, everyone.
Well, we're coming to you Sunday evening for me, I guess Sunday midday for you, Women's Day. Hope everyone's weekend has been pretty good. Hopefully you're staying kind of sane with all the coronavirus stuff.
Yeah.
Which can be difficult with all the coverage, But today I wanted to switch it away from that. Last week I think we covered enough on borders and the coronavirus, but this week I wanted to talk about something that is quietly sneaking into the headlines that no one's really talking about unless they follow foreign policy. And that's the current things happening with the Afghan government, the Taliban, and the United States. So basically, for people that don't know, on Leap Day, which was February 29th, the Taliban leaders and Mike Pompeo and the State Department met to discuss a potential ceasefire and quote-unquote peace deal. And over the last week, there were hopes of a ceasefire continuing, but things have gotten, I guess you could say, much more violent again. And so there's a lot of questions about if this deal was good, if it was bad, and what the long-term effects can be. And I just want to, I guess off the bat, just note that this deal was between the Afghan Taliban and the United States government, and the Afghani democratically elected government was not actually involved in this discussion. So, Drew, what are your first thoughts on this?
Well, first off, I wanted to address the fact that he mentioned it sneaking up in the headlines, which is interesting. I mean, we have things like the election and coronavirus, right, that kind of dominate. But it is fascinating that a lot of people aren't paying attention to the fact that we're potentially seeing the end of one of America's longest wars. I mean, this is a war we've been involved in since 2001, since October 2001. So, we're talking over 18 years. And we're talking about peace talks, and a lot of people don't really know that's going on. I think that just says something about, perhaps, how people don't really focus on foreign policy that much, or maybe this war has kind of been in the background for so long that people kind of forget about it. But as far as the peace talks themselves, I think that I'm not very optimistic. For the one is, we talked about, with the Israeli-Palestine kind of proposal, that if you have one side that's not even at the table, it's pretty much you consider it dead in the water. And this is what we're seeing with this one, where the Taliban is at the table and then the Afghan government is not. And I just don't see how you get, I don't see how you have a lasting peace when that's the case. And there's a lot of other reasons, below that we should start getting into. So for one is like recent attacks. The Taliban has continued to attack the Afghani government while the talks are going on, because the agreement we've had is, don't attack U.S. and coalition troops. And they said, okay, sure, but they're still attacking our ally, the Afghan government, and that's pretty much acting in bad faith.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think you mentioned it well when you talk about kind of comparing this to the Israel-Palestine issue, is because it's true. If you don't have both parties at the table, you're not going to have a meaningful long-term solution. And I think that is kind of what we're seeing, because the problem is that, as you kind of highlighted already, Afghanistan has been a complicated region since the Cold War, when Russian forces invaded and we helped the Mujahideen, right, which eventually led, over time to this Taliban force that pretty much made the 1990s a brutal, hopeless place. And since then, Afghanistan has pretty much been at war for 40 years, right? And they've had a lot of changes in government and a lot of very fundamentalist Islamic groups, such as the Taliban, who have pretty much made life difficult and quite just dangerous for day-to-day people. And I think roughly, according to The Economist, 3,500 civilians die every year, and this country is the poorest in Asia. So the situation is not good, which I don't think helps any way possible. And this war has costed taxpayers in the United States $1 trillion. And the reason why I'm outlining this is because I think at the end of the day, why this might not work is because the Trump administration, I think, wants to just get out on one of their campaign promises, which is getting out of Afghanistan.
Right.
And like a lot of other issues with the Trump administration when it comes to long-term policies, I think this is a half-assed policy that is just for a short-term, re-election campaign strategy. And And the issue is I was reading the New York Times up to this, and they had a good point. Is that there's a lot of secrecy involved in this talk. Defense Secretary Mark Esper doesn't really seem to be clear on certain aspects of it, and there were two classified annexes to this peace accord, which basically sound like they're outlining criteria for withdrawing troops, but the time period is difficult and it's over 18 months, and they don't really acknowledge the idea of what happens if violence continues and how do we broker talks with the Taliban and the Afghani government. So it just seems like a half-assed plan that it's not good when the actual government who needs to talk to the Taliban is not at the table, you know.
Right, and there's some significant flaws in the structure of like the balancing of the scales are really off in these talks. We had both read the article from John R. Allen, the president of the Brookings Institution. He wrote about this, and this is a guy who had led U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan from 2011 to 2013. He was basically saying that the U.S. committed to a significant number of measurable commitments, whereas the Taliban, they've committed to vague ending of violence and stuff. And it's really like you need to have measurable things to achieve that you can like keep and hold the Taliban accountable to, because we're doing that. We're saying, we're going to, move out this many troops by this time, and we're not giving them measurable things on their end. And then especially, again, the fact that the Afghanis are not on the table. Now, one of the few measurable things is the exchanging of prisoners, right? Mm-hmm. It's an agreement that the Taliban would get 5,000 prisoners out of Afghani government jails, right? The Afghani government would give up 5,000 Talibani prisoners in return for 1,000 Afghani government soldiers and prisoners. So it's basically a 5,000 to 1,000 swap. And that's a measurable thing that a lot of experts, I think, that is just not going to happen because the Afghani government has not been specific about agreeing to that. They say that, the U.S. and the coalition needs to oversee these prisoners exchanges, but they haven't ever agreed to this specific number. And I think that imbalance in that number might become an issue, especially when you have violence on top of it. I just don't see that happening.
Right. No, I think that's a really good point there. And I mean, I think it comes down to one of the root issues with this is that basically the Afghani government is going to be forced to acknowledge 5,000 hardened Taliban fighters, right?
Right.
And these are people that have killed women and children, Afghani military officials, Americans, and government officials. And so now you're putting a lot of faith in the Afghani government and saying, okay, now you actually need to trust the Taliban are going to keep to their word. And it's pretty hard to do that when they don't have any say in how this is happening. And also, all this really could mean is that the Taliban are just going to have more political strength because now the U.S. has kind of said basically, okay, like, don't hurt our guys and we'll let you figure this out. And I mean, that was kind of what the 90s or the 80s and 90s were like, which obviously didn't end well. And the second thing is foreign policy had a kind of interesting point is that this kind of just seems like a very wimpy way for the U.S. government to basically just say withdrawal forces and admit defeat.
Right.
Like obviously on paper, it looks good to see peace deal with the Taliban, which I mean, I think both of us are probably for talk, right? But it's not beneficial right now because it just seems like the U.S. wants to get out, and it's true that 5,000 forces for 1,000 Afghani officials, that just doesn't sound good to me. And also, I'm just curious how much this is actually going to stop the Taliban, because obviously leading up to the peace deal on February 29th, there was a ceasefire, and there are some optimistic sides of that because according to what I have here, I think there was let me confirm, but I think there was a 52% decrease in violence, which, so it says, according to the Afghanistan Analyst Network, crime and death had fallen by 90% in that 4-day truce period. So obviously that's a positive, but as we've seen, violence has just increased again.
Yeah, and again, it's this acting. The Taliban is acting in bad faith, right? You know, for example, there is actually a deputy leader of the Taliban. I'm going to butcher the name, but it's Sirajuddin Haqqani. He is a deputy leader of the Taliban. He was published by the New York Times, and he was as an opinion piece. It's called "What We the Taliban Want," and man, it reads like propaganda. And he never really admits any fault, but he has an interesting point where he says, we want like a discussion with all Afghanis. Let me try to find the exact quote here. But he talks about how he wants like to work with other Afghanis to find out our own government reflected by there. It's important that no one front loads this process with predetermined outcomes and preconditions. We are committed to working with other parties in a consultative manner of genuine respect to agree on a new, inclusive political system in which the voice of every Afghan is reflected, where no Afghan feels excluded. Looks great on paper, but then the same week, the Taliban killed 32 innocent civilians at a gathering. And it's like, how can you say that, we genuine respect or agree on a new inclusive political system, which voice of every Afghan is reflected when you're literally killing Afghani civilians? And this is a deputy leader. This is not, this is a guy that's in charge of decision makings within the Taliban. So, you can see how they're not claiming responsibility. They're not focusing on the past. They're only looking forward, right? They're not acknowledging what the terribleness of the past that they have helped create. And yeah, it was pretty interesting to see this on the New York Times. Now, it's an opinion piece, right? It's not like it's reporting, but it was pretty crazy to see a Taliban leader published on an American news site.
Yeah, I didn't read the whole opinion thing, but I like remember seeing that, and that is pretty crazy. I mean, I think it's good that it was put out there because I think it is good for people to, get this opinion and hear what these guys think. But let's be completely honest. They are not going to be able to unify parties in Afghanistan because I'm going to butcher this name horribly as well. But this guy's last name is Stankazai, who leads the Taliban's political office in Doha. And he has claimed that there is no real government in Kabul, mainly because the Taliban won't accept it because this was a government propped up by the Western conquerors, as he calls them. This was a government that the Obama administration helped put up with democratic values. And if the Taliban don't believe this government to be authentic, then there's no way they're going to work with them. So, I think this is all just, I think they're just lying to us, like clearly has happened in the past, and they're just waiting for the U.S. to leave.
Right.
Foreign policy says there's a grim joke going around parts of Afghanistan. In quotes, if you want to be safe from Taliban attacks, move next to a U.S. airbase. I have never seen a dead American soldier, said Fatah Sattar, a civil engineer from the northern province of Baghlan. It's Afghans killing Afghans, and I guess this will not stop so quickly. So, it's a true reality is that I think this is going to potentially save American troop lives, but the reality is we were there to kind of broker some sort of stability. I'm not going to say a peace because we're far from that, but and then the second thing is even if the Taliban leaders, did want to actually work together with the Afghani government, the problem is also, according to the Brookings article, is the Taliban are decentralized. So even if you stop one regional group of the Taliban from killing civilians or a ceasefire, who knows if the whole country, or what about the Pakistani Taliban? Like, it's not like the Taliban are just a country that can just uniformly make a decision. So I just think I think Mike Pompeo and the State Department didn't really do their homework.
Yeah, well, and I think it's a really good point that, the Taliban is not like this monolithic, super hierarchical structure. Like it's definitely got, and especially when you're bombed so frequently, you're going to be fractured and different and have probably different factions within itself. It's not going to be easy to control all the Taliban because one guy says something and one guy agrees to something. On top of that, too, is the Afghan government. Their forces are not exactly a well-oiled machine either. I watched a documentary called "This Is What Winning Looks Like." It's from Vice in 2013. Now, this is 2013, so granted, it's a little dated. But there's nothing it drew a shocking picture of how ill prepared the Afghani security forces are and how tied the American forces were to we couldn't do everything to help them because of restrictions, but it also led for example, when took place at let me see right here. It took place at the Forward Operating Base Jackson in the town of Sangin, Afghanistan, which in 2013 was one of the most violent regions of Afghanistan. Our job was to facilitate helping the Afghan security forces, get prepared for taking, leading Afghan citizens, protecting Afghan citizens for an Afghanistan run by them, right? That's our whole purpose, was to not just kill the Taliban, but to help build up the Afghani security forces. But these guys were found to be on heroin, right? They were like on patrol doing opium, and the American forces were like, hey man, you guys can't be doing opium on patrol. They would shoot at civilians. They would like just shoot at civilians and say they're all Taliban, they're all Taliban. And we had to constantly be like, that's not professional. You need to ID your targets. Like these guys seemed ill prepared. They were drinking on the job. And so when finally a commanding officer was brought in to kind of whip these guys into shape, it turns out that commanding officer also had a problem with like buying and basically raping young boys. And the United States had complained about it. The major at this base was complaining about it and was basically told, look, we can't do anything about it. It's out of our jurisdiction. And it really didn't paint a good picture of the Afghan security forces. They seemed completely ill prepared, uninspired, and when they did have some leadership, the leadership was severely flawed, to a point where no one was winning this war, and the Afghan citizens would easily side with the Taliban if they knew that the Afghan security forces were, raping kids and shooting civilians. It did not look like a government that could easily take over a new democracy.
Yeah, that's quite concerning. Like I was telling you before we started recording, I'm gonna have to watch this because I have not. But yeah, that's that's quite disturbing, And I think it kind of goes to the point that Afghanistan's a failed state. There's just no way to sugarcoat it. It is their government in Kabul probably has a very limited amount of control over the country. It was propped up by the United States, which obviously I do support democratic values, but clearly Afghanistan is not ready for a democratic system yet. And it's true. I think wherever you go, you'll find that because of how fractionalized the state became from 40 years of war, from the Russians to the Americans to the Taliban to now this current crisis. I think there's pretty much the best people are probably either dead, fractioned, or working for different tribes in the area, and so it just sounds like, again, we're trying to solve the problem using what we understand in the West. And at the end of the day, the only thing that's helping is just having a small but qualified group of soldiers there. Propping up democracy clearly hasn't worked. A peace deal with the Taliban is probably not going to work. And sadly, the only reality seems to be that our peacekeeping forces are trying to help. And now by pulling out over half of them over the next 12 months, I don't see how that's going to be beneficial at all. Because like you said, this military, I don't think they have the ethics or just the discipline.
Right. Or the logistical, or even the logistics of it's a sad situation. And it's like, again, this is kind of it's basically another Vietnam, where we got involved in a country where we thought we could change their direction and their political, their political direction, and we couldn't. Now there's not like there's a communist China backing the Taliban. The Taliban's pretty much just maybe has some backing from like Al Qaeda, but it's been on its own, a rebel group, and we still have not been able to stamp it out. I mean, again, 18 years in a country, we've proven time and time and again that it's pretty much impossible to manufacture a democracy in a unstable Middle Eastern state. But now we're so deep in that if we just leave like we are now, right, like it's just gonna leave it worse than we started. And I thought it was very interesting that Trump is so set on doing these talks, because this is a guy that said, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. And like, that's exactly what we're doing now. And we're negotiating with terrorists without our ally at the table. Again, this just seems so dead in the water, but it's also hard to know what the solution is, because I do want to get out, but I don't want to get out in a way that's just going to lead to chaos.
Well, and we clearly don't learn from history, because like you said, Vietnam is a perfect example of a similar system. You can't just build a political ideology by invading a country. And second, I think, why don't we learn from history with Iraq? Trump's really criticized Obama for pulling out of Iraq and not getting involved in Syria, when we probably should have. But it's ironic that Trump's now kind of pretty much trying to do the same thing, which, for his defense, which is not a strong defense, I get why you want to get out of Afghanistan. It's been a blunder. It's cost us thousands of lives, and it's expensive, and there's really no outcome. But again, the way they're doing it doesn't make sense to me. And I'm also worried about Trump leading this, because he, in an interview on, I think, Friday at the White House, said countries have to take care of themselves. You can hold someone's hand for so long. And when he was asked if the Taliban might seize control of the government, Trump said it's not supposed to happen that way, but it possibly will. And so I don't think he cares really who is involved. Obviously, he seems to like strongmen and authoritarians and anti-democrats. So I don't think truly his administration cares if the Taliban take over. I think they just want out of there. And that to me is one of the scarier things. And I think the sad part too is in that Brookings article where they're talking about if the U.S. doing this, we are failing to recognize kind of our standard of human rights and women's rights around the world, because by leaving Afghanistan, we're just going to allow the Taliban to go back to their very old conservative fundamental view of Islam, which is not good for anybody and led to a lot of women and children being killed, shot, raped, etc. And so this exactly oppressed. That's the word I was looking for. But yeah, it's unfortunate that I don't think the administration seems to care. They want a quick win, and it's probably just going to resort back to the 90s or worse. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. So taking a step back, do I feel that the Afghani people should have the sovereignty to hold their own government? Of course. But if that government is the Taliban, which completely disregards human rights, and I think that Brookings Institute guy also agreed. Like he said, it's incompatible with modernity, right? Their ideology is incompatible with the way we view human rights in the world, and so right. Even if you agree that okay, maybe the Taliban has to take over, we just have to let them do their thing. It's you're just accepting that human rights violations just in their ideology. That's just what it is. And now, and in that opinion from the guy from the Taliban, he says, we'll respect the rights of women in regard, and as they are here it is we together will find a way to build an Islamic system in which all Afghans have equal rights, where the rights of women that are granted by Islam, from the right to education to the right to work, are protected, and where merit is the basis for equal opportunity. Again, it's that's just so he threw that right back in there, as they're granted by Islam. It's you're basically just they just want a theocratic state, and I don't think theocracies are compatible with modernity, like the guy from the Brookings Institute mentioned, and so that's who's taking over.
Yeah, no, that's and it's kind of terrifying, because then you have just the international discussion of, obviously, a lot of the UN Council on Human Rights wouldn't even recognize this Taliban government. They haven't been in the past, and so then it just convolutes the water. And no, but you're right. It's just such a backward spiral if we do this. And obviously, I don't know what the solution is. And unfortunately, like I said, I mean, Afghanistan is a failed state. It's been coined the place where empires go to die, and we've seen it time and time again. It's a tribal place. It has very rugged and dangerous landscape, and some of the highest mountains in the world that divide regions and divide people and divide ideologies. And it's just its landscape. It's just geographical positioning in the world makes it a hard place to really form a unified country. And I'm just concerned that we could just see a fallback. And plus, on another note, I'm worried about the vacuum the U.S. leaving would cause, because that there are other powers in the world that probably will get involved or maybe want to take advantage of this situation.
Yes. Yes, China, Russia, to name a few. I could say how they would want to somehow profit, or perhaps, support a new government, but that is a little more down with Belt and Road, more down with Putin, right? Sure, that vacuum certainly is not just going to be left unfilled. And again, I always said I just think that the Afghani government is just completely ill prepared for what they're about to take on if the U.S. leaves. But then that begs the question. So then what? Does the U.S. stay there for another 18 years? It's we've dug a hole so deep it's hard to get out of without hurting.
Yeah, and I mean that's a true point. How long does this last? It's been a quagmire. But I mean, I guess Ash Carter, who was, I think he was Secretary of Defense for Barack Obama, think I've mentioned this on the show before, but he was on, I think he was on Pod Save America a while back, and he basically said that one of the issues that kept up most leaders, including himself and Barack Obama, at night was the fact of the Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan getting their hands on nuclear weapons.
Right.
And that was one of his defenses for maintaining at least some sort of a force in that area. And so that's something that worries me too, is that if we're going to cut our troops, and I think it was 5 bases by July, if I'm correct, that's a lot. That's losing a lot of resources in the area for a government, like you said, that is not ready to handle this. And plus, you also have Pakistan, and you have the Pakistani side of the Taliban. And it's just, like I said, because of its borders and its mountains, Pakistan and Afghanistan, there's just kind of a filter through with these, Taliban groups. I mean, the Taliban originally came from Pakistan. And so I'm just worried that this is just going to embolden them. And the leaders have been saying that maybe the violence with U.S. forces is over, but their jihad isn't.
Right. You think of a very good point about Pakistan. That's definitely going to be a player that will see this and be like, oh, perfect. Like we will absolutely support the Taliban to take over. Again, we have to remember that even though Pakistan said they had no idea, they pretty much were harboring Osama bin Laden. Like they have pretty close ties to the Taliban, Al Qaeda. They're obviously pro, like Islamic State kind of shit. Probably gonna edit that out. Pro Islamic State. Right, like an Islamic, radical Islamic State. So, yeah, I can see how Pakistan would be a huge problem. They're probably going to go do everything they can to go against. And that's one of the main things in the agreement, right, is we're saying, hey, Taliban, you cannot allow international groups to use Afghanistan as a lane for their terrorism. And they said, oh, yeah, sure. But I don't buy that. I don't buy that. I 100% think that they still have ties to Al Qaeda. I mean, half of these guys were literally in both. And so... do we trust the Afghan security forces to be that good with their intelligence and counterintelligence and international, operations to make sure that Al Qaeda in Pakistan and, other ISIS is not using Afghanistan as a lane for their terrorism? I just don't I think that's definitely going to happen. And there's no way the Afghan government is going to be able to counteract that. I honestly think the Taliban will win. If there's a civil war without any U.S. involvement between the Taliban and the Afghan security forces, my money's on the Taliban, and that's not a good thing.
No, you're correct. I would also, I'm not a betting man, but yeah, I would definitely put money on the Taliban there, just because, I mean, they have the international audience and they have the resources, while the Afghani government just does not. And I think an important thing to note too is that I think a lot of foreign observers, just average people, kind of put the Taliban and ISIS and Al Qaeda and Hamas and all these groups kind of into one thing of just jihadist terrorists. But the Taliban are, I think, a little bit more complicated, because they were kind of a really extremist religious school that came out of Pakistan, and I think for them, they align with terrorist groups when it helps them, but they're almost more of kind of a revolutionary, or not revolutionary, I guess we could call it a regressive movement, but they're more of an actual political ideology than I would say an Al Qaeda or an ISIS, which I think is harder to combat, because ISIS and some of these other ones have kind of come out of U.S. involvement, right? They've come out of Western involvement in their territories and their kind of distaste of Western culture. And yes, the Taliban is to a certain extent, but I think for them it's more of a national movement as well, and so it's something harder to really get rid of over time, and it's also something harder to understand, I think.
Yeah, I did catch that when I read the opinion article from the deputy of the Taliban. He definitely seemed like a nationalist, where he was talking about Afghans by Afghans for Afghans, that kind of thing, every Afghan voice, all that. Now, of course, I think it's a load of propaganda, but it definitely showed like there was a lot of nationalistic ties. And then the religion was kind of tagged onto it, similar to how maybe similar-ish, comparable at least to how in Vietnam it was more about Vietnamese nationalism, but they adopted the whole communism angle to get support and to bring a second layer to it. But originally they were nationalists fighting for their sovereignty. You could argue the Taliban is the same. Now, the way they fight for their sovereignty is through terrorism, right? Again, I'm not condoning it, but the old adage is still true, right? One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And in this case, the Taliban views themselves as freedom fighters. And yeah, they
Right.
definitely have that nationalistic tint. That's very true.
Right, right. So, no, I mean, I think it's going to be quite complicated to solve this issue, and I just, I just at the end of the day don't really trust Mike Pompeo. That's my problem to some regards of this. I mean, him and Esper, two guys that have been interviewed a lot involving this, because obviously the Department of Defense and the State Department are going to be involved in this, and both of them just both seem kind of, I don't want to say uninformed, because obviously they do know what's happening there, but they just don't seem like they're the right guys to be making these decisions, and they're two yes men. A better Secretary of State, I think, would maybe step back from Trump and say, yes, we need to get out of here, but what's the plan? We used to have guys like Mattis and even Rex Tillerson that could do this, McMaster, but now we just have guys that kind of go along and need to kind of spin the story to the press to make it sound better.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
They're
I don't know.
they're looking for that quick victory before the election. It does seem like that is the case. Yeah. I don't know, man. It's rough. It's rough, and it's a shame. It's a shame that it's such a morass and such a quagmire for so long. And of course, the real losers are unfortunately are the Afghan people, right? They've been torn and pulled between two sides, and in that documentary from Vice, they even mentioned they talk to local farmers that are going through and they're asking about Taliban positions and how can we help out. Like they're trying to be as accommodating as ever, and the farmers are like, look, man, when you leave, the Taliban will be here asking me the same thing about you in an hour and a half. That's how quick it's like. It's like as soon as you're gone, they're here, and then as soon as they go, then you're here, and it's like we just want peace. I just want to be able to raise my goats or raise my farm or have my store or whatever it is. And they're all, and it seems like a lot of people are just so sick of both sides that they'll side with whoever is more is the better bet for them to have a stable regular life. I don't think a lot of Afghani people are going to be very ideologically based after 18 years of chaos. They probably just want stability, whether it's stability under the Taliban, whether it's stability under the Afghan government, but they're just going to pick whoever's more convenient at the time. And I don't blame them, but that's the reality is as soon as we dip, the Taliban's going to just swoop in where they can.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very, very good point. And it's something that I don't think we can solve, nor this current Afghani government, and unfortunately, really the international community right now, because it's true. It's just a divided, decentralized country, and neither the Taliban nor the government have the resources to actually unite the country. And until there is that agreement, I think it needs to be between them, and maybe that does mean. I mean, I don't know how this would be possible because the Taliban doesn't trust this government, but there needs to be a deal between the two of them, not with the U.S. And I don't know how that's possible, unfortunately. So I think you're right, is that I think most people just want answers and solutions and stability. And unfortunately, for a lot of people stuck in the middle, I think that could mean reverting back to 1990s Afghanistan.
Right. Yeah. So. I mean, gosh. It's a mess. It's probably going to have to get unfortunately, it's probably going to have to get a lot worse before it gets better. Because this is just the end. Like you said, this is just the end of the U.S. kind of occupation or involvement. And then a lot of these guys are saying it's just the beginning of the Jihad. So it might have to be a rough time before Afghanistan can finally find out its own personal identity free from foreign involvement.
Yeah, no, completely. And I mean, I try to be optimistic at times, and this deal did take, I think, about 18 months of due diligence and planning, and some U.S. officials have said that the optimistic side is just any decrease in violence over the long term is still something.
Sure.
And maybe after an 18 months of discussion, maybe there is more to it. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I don't trust the Taliban. There's no reason why I should. But you never know. Humans, I think most humans are inherently good. And so, I don't know, to at least end my thoughts on an optimistic note, you never know.
You never know. Well, the another round of the agreements and talks are going to be going on in a few days later this week in March. And so hopefully we see some better news, but hopefully the Taliban stops using a spike in violence as a bargaining chip, because that's what's going on, right? Is they're using this quick spike in violence to try and better their position at the table, but the U.S. obviously sees through it. So
Right.
hopefully things get better, but I don't know. Like you said, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, God, I'm just looking at some of these numbers here, and I mean, on March 3rd, the Taliban attacked no fewer than 43 government checkpoints in just one of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. On that same day, they killed 15 Afghani soldiers. Yeah. I mean, I think first things first, they're going to need a longer period of de-escalation before they can actually talk about anything. 4 to 5 days of 90% decrease in deaths is not too promising.
Yes. Yep. Well, with that light-hearted, fun topic,
we just love those around here, guys.
That'll be this episode of the Tonic Accord podcast. Thank you all for listening. Please, as always, we want to hear your opinions. Leave a comment on our YouTube channel, on the video. Comments on Podbean. Leave us a like. Give us a heart. Hit the bell. All that stuff. We appreciate it, and we thank you for listening.